Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Lean Startup webcast. Today's topic is getting your old school company to embrace a new innovation strategy. I'm Sarah Bouvignon, Marketing Manager of Lean Startup Company. Lean Startup Week is less than 3 weeks away. If you're planning on joining us in San Francisco, grab your pass before October 15th to save with our fall sale. Our speakers today are Amee Mungo, Client Leadership at GoKart Labs, and James Warren, founder of Share More Stories and Senior Director of Brand Strategy of JMI. Moderating is Stacy Conlon, Director of Business Development for Lean Startup Company's education program. You can catch Amee and James during Lean Startup Week on November 3rd in a panel on this topic with Humana's Geeta Wilson and Clevertech's Michael Hagler. Stacy will be moderating a fireside chat with President and COO of LegalZoom, Frank Monster. You can find more information at 2017.leanstartup.co. A few housekeeping notes. We'll be taking questions from the audience via the live chat. If you'd like to ask a question, please flag it by starting with a Q: before your question. We're raffling off a silver pass to Lean Startup Week. For a chance to win, simply add to the chat conversation with a question or comment during the broadcast. This will be a 45-minute program, and the recording will be available after this live webcast. Take it away, Stacy.
Thank you, Sarah. And hello, everyone. Amee and James, it's an absolute pleasure to connect with you today and facilitate this discussion about how to get your old school company to embrace a new innovation strategy. So today, let's just kick it off by learning just a little bit more about each of you and your connection to this topic. So Amee, let's begin with you. How did you get involved with this part of Lean Startup?
With this part of Lean Startup, I don't even remember the original spark there, but I have been in startups here on the East Coast. I've been in small company. I founded 3 companies of my own, and I've been in and out of like the Fortune 100 as either a consultant to or as an employee of. So as you can see, I've kind of been navigating that tension my entire career, and now I guess I've had enough decades of it where I have a point of view on it. And now I get to practice that as a client strategist for my current company, GoKart Labs, where I'm helping these Fortune 100 and 500 companies navigate the exact topic we're talking about today as it pertains to digital product development.
Got it. Thanks, Amee. That's great. And how about you, James? Tell us a little bit about your connection to this topic.
Sure. Well, I spent the majority of my career early on actually working on new products and new business development in Fortune 100 companies as well. And more recently, over the last several years, I sort of pivoted into the startup side of things. And now what I really work on is developing insights for brands and companies that are looking to develop new lines of business and new products. So for me, it's a perfect marriage of those 2 experiences as well.
Wonderful. Well, great. Thank you both. Well, today I'd like to kick things off by just giving a little bit of background as to why this is such an important topic to cover. So as you guys know, hundreds of large companies across every industry, really all around the world, are now adopting Lean Startup techniques. And these range from highly regulated industries like oil and gas, to healthcare and financial services companies, to large retail and technology behemoths, to transportation companies, and even the US Department of Defense. And why is that? Well, it's interesting because they really realize that they have to keep up with an evolving market or else they'll become irrelevant. And in fact, more than 50% of Fortune 500 companies have vanished from the list since the year 2000, according to the World Economic Forum. So, in many cases, startups are really nipping at the heels of large old school organizations because they're able to be nimble and move quickly, and they're just not stuck in an old way of doing things from years and years of doing things the same way. But of course, this is a huge problem because with things like the continued push of the internet, smart products, and new business models into every market, this continues to drive disruption and competition, which means that large organizations who don't innovate will get left behind. I've seen that hashtag, innovate or die, right?
Right.
But getting your old school company to embrace innovation is not easy, especially because it affects several different aspects and layers of an organization, not only because of outdated systems and structures, but also the mindset and the behavior of the folks in these organizations. So this is where I'd really like to spend our time today, exploring a few key areas, including strategy, culture, and people. And here's some tips from you, some tips from the battlefield, so to speak, and learn more about some concrete steps, tactics, and approaches that in your experiences will help turn short-term visions of entrepreneurship into long-term systems of innovation that even the most bureaucratic of organizations can follow. So with that, Amee, let's begin with you. In thinking about company strategy, for example, like how does a company balance the tension between the core business and the new?
Right, and I think, and James and I probably agree on this, and probably a lot of us in this position will, there's two schools of thought there, right? Everybody has the best intentions when they start out, like, oh, we can balance this with our core work. Innovation is a mindset we want to proliferate across our organization. It's the way we want our people to believe in themselves and be fearless in their exploration and whatnot. But the truth is, and I think this is something that we're all kind of coming to very rapidly, the core business must exist and it must flourish in spite of, in addition to innovation. And how cultures, companies handle that varies across the board. Some companies want to do the 50-50 split. And in my experience, the best way that works is when you get the directive, support, leadership, and guardianship from the senior most executives that are kind of issuing that charge, where those executives actually make it, I hate to say mandate when we're talking about innovation and exploration, but they make it a mandate that the people that are charged with innovation or pushing something through in a new and different way are truly given 50% of their work week, whatever that might look like, to share their workload and to do work differently and manage the core. And I said the word guardianship because yes, we all guard our own time and we would expect that of our direct managers, but and James and I have talked about this a lot, the task of really awesome middle management always is to manage the core to optimize the business, right? That is their goal. But when you have people on your team that are being told, oh, 50% of your week is for also, optimizing our innovation efforts, that's not a win situation for anybody. So that senior executive leadership really needs to come all the way down where everybody in the organization understands the metrics, the split of time, and the encouragement of teams, and that is protected. And I would say I've only seen one or two companies actually get this right. And it was for very condensed time, like 12 weeks or so, because the core eventually takes over. And then, of course, I think we all have experience in, hey, we have our, 7 years ago, it was the digital arm, right? We have our digital entrepreneurs, our digital innovators that we have, and they're their own vertical. And look at them go. They're like in their own little fishbowl, and they're just doing awesome things. And yay! And they're collaborative. How do we all learn from them? And those models continue to be super successful. They have tweaked. They've become more mindful of P&L, and marketing strategy now, which is a wonderful thing, right? It's a give and take on both sides. But I think it's first for that organization to really take an assessment of itself and say, how do we feel we can manage this? And if we feel like we're failing, what is our fallback strategy? How are we going to course correct before sinking millions of dollars and risking employees leaving because it was a bad experience? Sorry, I get really passionate about this topic in particular.
Yeah, exactly. No, there's a lot of moving parts in there too. I mean, not only having that support really of the senior leadership just sounds really key in that particular instance, and having the right metrics in place. And so I'm curious, and James, if you want to weigh in, or Amee, continue, I'd love to just, maybe hear some examples. And maybe it could be just a challenge that a company was facing where the senior leadership wasn't bought in, or even maybe a successful story around some metrics that were in place. I'd love to add a little color for the audience around some examples of how a company really did balance that core and the new.
Sure, well, I'll share one. I think first is, to Amee's point, that there is a tension and therefore there's a balance. And I think part of the trick here is embracing that. You really want to embrace that tension early on, because you have to do both. You have to find a way to get the organization rallied around and motivated around doing both. So I can think of an experience of my own where I was working on new business, new product development, the innovation space, if you will, for the enterprise I was working in. And originally, we were set apart. The team was formed. We actually were located off-site, separate from the headquarters. And that was great in terms of being able to sort of create a culture and an environment around our team and our work. We moved really, really fast. We had lots of resources. We had the support of pretty much the entire senior team. And then we started to engage the functional areas that maybe had to provide a support role and figure out how do we start to commercialize this. And in their capacity, they would often come out to our location. We again thought that was great in terms of culture building and sort of building this idea that this is where innovation happens. And so again, in terms of getting to market, creating a product, getting it launched, that process worked well, and it was also very fun and rewarding. The challenges came after we launched. The challenges came in terms of, now how do you sustain this? Because we had done a great job engaging senior management. We had done a great job engaging people who in their different departments were responsible to support us, but we hadn't engaged the broader organization. And we really hadn't engaged functional leadership beyond senior management. And so what we started to realize is, in order for this to be a sustained effort and a successful effort where additional products were coming through the pipeline, maybe we shouldn't stay apart. Maybe we needed to sort of be more integrated into the rest of the enterprise. And so we did. We moved back physically. We also found ways to integrate directly into the different lines of business. And so we got closer to that blended, our hybrid version that Amee just articulated. Still had very clear roles and responsibilities. We still had a very clear new business development function. But now, instead of us having situations where middle managers were coming to work with us, but functional leaderships were not engaged, we were going to functional leadership early, and we were talking to them about what we wanted to do, getting their input and perspective and buy-in, and they were starting to identify the resources and the infrastructure and the processes that they needed to make changes in their organization to accommodate us with. And so it turned out to be a much better process going forward. It led to more sustainability around the innovation system, which I think is key for a lot of large enterprises. Getting that first product out the door is one thing. Having a sustainable infrastructure where you can continue to launch new products through that pipeline, that's really where the challenge is. Any opportunity.
Yeah, interesting. So it really sounds like, pulling away made sense for some part of time, but then reintegration and the importance of engaging senior leadership along the way and having a high amount of communication along the way as well sounds really important.
Definitely. And I would just say senior leadership is often not the biggest challenge, because typically they're brought in, there's a high level, multi-year plan mandate that says, look, we've got to innovate or die, to your point. We've got to figure out what our pathway forward is. But it's that massive middle, the large part of the organization that really drives a lot of decision making. It drives a lot of behavior. People are a lot more autonomous than we give them credit for. And so if you want people to be part of innovation because they believe in it, because they think it's right for the company, and therefore they think it's right for them, you got to engage them, and you got to engage them early in the process. I think that's the biggest piece of strategy that is often the hardest part to implement. So you got to focus on that.
Plus, I would like to add there that massive middle. I think so many times the massive middle is so critical to all corporations. Their tasks, or what they're tasked with on a yearly basis, only keep growing. Nobody is editing away from that, and they're accumulating their own professional debt, right? Yeah. And so when someone says innovation is super important, and we're gonna go to all lean startup conferences, and we're gonna do that, we're gonna have Eric come in and do our senior leadership. Well, that's awesome, but it can't trickle down fast enough. And then they go and they do their design thinking training, but the problem is it never becomes muscle memory. And when you can't practice it, it's not sustainable. And so that's where I think you have to have your strategy, like, okay, I want to immerse my people in this because the new is coming. And then are we going to see the actual work being done by internal product development teams somewhere else, or internal digital marketing teams, whatever that is? Are we going to bring in consultants to work side by side with us? Are we going to ship it out of the walls, literally outside of the walls, to protect that autonomy and speed to market?
Yeah, no easy task. Absolutely. Well, and I want to shift gears in a moment, but I really would love, for the audience today to just hear from you. I mean, especially with this massive middle and this importance of engaging early, what kind of action, how can the audience sort of get started now, today, by actually helping them to get engaged? What's sort of something they can get started with to make that happen?
Well, I think part of it is, let's assume for now you have an opportunity around engagement. I think the first thing to do is to go walk down the hall, walk into the offices of those functional areas that you're dependent on to get your new product, your new business out the door, and start having conversations around, number one, what's on their plate? What are some of those other things that, to Amee's point, maybe aren't getting edited because that's their context and that's their reality. Yeah. And so having a little bit of conversation, show them that you're there to listen, show them that we're all working towards the same objective, that's key. Then you all to do it inside. So go sit down and have that conversation, not just about the vision, but what really is the rationale, the strategic rationale for this particular new product or new brand that you're introducing. Why do you think it's going to be successful, and why do you need their help to be successful? I think when you create that context for collaboration, you also acknowledge where they're coming from, what they've got on their plate. Most folks are willing to have a conversation, a dialogue on how to resolve that, in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And sorry to be so pragmatic, but on all of that really good activism, also having your own rating metrics for how much each stakeholder means to you and your initiative.
Absolutely.
High noise, low input people that are just going to suck your energy and time away and just destroy your team's morale. Where if you have more of a quiet contributor, but that can really drive work that you can build with, those are the people to bring kind of like into that inner circle. And I'm a big celebrator of the silent performers in industry. And those are the people that I want with me. And then I would even like to just go for one quick second into a more granular level.
Sure.
I love it when I see organizations that even if they're not co-located with their tech development teams and their design teams, they force collaboration and they will like spend a few days a week with their head of UX, their head of product, maybe a business analyst, depending on what industry you're in, and also the tech lead for the development pod. You know, we're bleeding into dual track agile a little bit. But this way, you're all like kind of like creating your own language and norms. So even when, you know, you might be in 4 different offices most of the month, when you come together, you have this established like mini culture and you're creating transparency and collaboration with that core team initially. And then what I have seen happen is that becomes addictive. And then people kind of start sniffing it out and want to be part of it. And the best way to start selling your products without calling a meeting is to invite somebody in to a collaboration whiteboarding session, or I call it rogue customer research. Anything that can happen outside of a focus group facility, I'm all in for.
Yeah.
Take them onto the sidewalks. You have to be city streets so you don't get arrested. We've been there, but you know, and get that real time user feedback on whatever it is you're, you know, for a $5 Starbucks card. It's the most wonderful research ever. But when you bring people into the way that you're doing your work differently, then it's up to that individual to decide, am I tolerant of this as a professional in my organization? Or am I going to be a true core performer and rock that and let other people take on this? And it's just as important knowing who you are versus who you are not, right?
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, it really sounds like, too, what I'm hearing within all of this, it's sort of, you know, starting with awareness and then communication and really identifying your own metrics, too, around, you know, who are those folks that make sense to collaborate with, and kind of begin your own culture initially within that group. And we're going to talk about culture, too, in a little bit. Okay. But before we do, I would like to switch gears just a little bit and talk a little bit more about people, right? Because certainly the strategy is incredibly important as far as how you set this up and the ways of working. The framework is a bit different than the core business. But in thinking about the right people, right? Recruiting the right folks to be on the innovation bus, so to speak. Yeah. So, you know, James, this time I'd love to begin with you. You know, when you think about those star performing employees, high potential employees, you know, what kind of skill sets and behaviors do you see are really important to be successful in innovation functions?
Sure. So this actually builds on something that Amee shared a little while ago, which is, you know, the folks who work, quote unquote, on the core, their job is to make that run as efficiently as possible.
Right.
And that is inherently a management mindset. You are streamlining. You want to minimize variability. You want to be able to get every ounce of executional excellence out of that what. And I won't say it's exactly the opposite, but there's a lot of things that deviate from that in terms of the type of work and the mindset needed for that work when you're talking about innovation. You need a lot more flexibility. You need a lot more ability to sort of move, zoom in, zoom out. You need the ability to be thoughtful but speedy at the same time. You need people who think more in terms of design, who think more like the architect or even the engineer versus necessarily the person who's there to make sure that the building stays operational. And so one of the things that I've observed over my time working with clients in my own career, sometimes, you know, folks who might be really that hypo individual who's really great at leading an established existing business, they're really, really good at that. And we look at these new business opportunities and we say, oh, therefore, let's put this person over that opportunity, that initiative, because, you know, it's a big initiative. It's reporting to the senior team. Let's let them run that. And sometimes that's not the right call because that skill set isn't there. And so I always go to behaviors. I always look at, you know, what are the examples, even in an enterprise, when you're staffing or recruiting internally, what are those examples where they've sort of bucked the trend a little bit, you know, definitely within the values, staying within the values, but they've showed examples in their work where they're willing to kind of go a little bit left when everybody else wants to go right. They're willing to sit back and ask the deeper why questions. They're really willing to concept, and they're okay with being in messy places and spaces.
Right.
That's the kind of individual that you're looking for. It doesn't mean they won't be somebody who also happens to be really good at process and really good at management and really good at execution, because those things are important too. It just means that you're looking for some of those mindset skills, those mindsets and those behaviors that really suggest they'll be comfortable figuring things out as they go. I had a great quote from one of my leaders when I was in this space. And he always used to say, you know, the big difference about what we're doing is we're building a rocket ship and taking off at the same time. So
Right.
you need people who are comfortable with that idea that you might be putting duct tape on the outside of the rocket ship even while you're counting down the blast off. And that's just a different mindset. They definitely will exist inside a large enterprise, but you have to go look for them. And I would suggest you start by writing a job description from the ground up. It actually doesn't look much at all like what that equivalent job description would be on the core. Borrow descriptions, borrow terms, borrow responsibilities that look more like that job in a startup would. I think you'll be able to connect with and engage people more lined up for that kind of work.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. And I think too, you know, in thinking about those best practices, it looks very differently. So you have to come at it in a different way. And you're really looking for those people. You know, I heard one of our senior faculty say recently, you know, get comfortable being uncomfortable, because this is just how it is. And some folks are wired that way more than others. And so they might be lurking in your existing business and kind of keeping an eye out for it. Or, you know, if you're going to look to hire others, it's really important to be looking for those skill sets that are very different than what you might be used to. Go ahead. Yes.
Sorry, just one quick add to that. That's also where that functional leadership, that middle management engagement comes into play.
Okay.
Because when those folks are really bought in to what you're trying to accomplish and what the long-term vision is and what you're trying to build in the organization in terms of capability and capacity around innovation, then they can start to be partners in the talent process. Instead of feeling like you're coming to take their best and their brightest, they start saying, hey, this is my best and brightest for this role. This is my best and my brightest for this job. You want this person on your team. And that also creates shared accountability, because if they're going to put their recommendations on the team to move things faster, better, smarter, you know that they're going to be making sure that that person has the support back in their organization to get it done.
Yeah. And I also look for people that are, part of me wants to say unafraid to learn versus excited to learn, because I think there's a difference. Because I think you know, anybody that puts themselves on our own career trajectory wants to be excited to learn. But when you're unafraid to learn, whether you're a technologist, you're a data scientist, an analyst, a human-centered designer, that means that you're raw and you're vulnerable, and that makes you vulnerable to customer input, right? And the world around you, and also the stakeholders around you, which really prepares you well when it comes to stakeholder alignment as well. Because you're not going to be an order taker, right? To say, oh, we had to do this because the senior ranking most person said X, Y, or Z. You can digest it and see how it fits, if it fits, and then be able to communicate back. So for all those reasons, James said like he likes to recruit and who he looks for. I also look for that mix on teams of who has the high EQ, who's unafraid to learn, who can bring others into the mix that can be vulnerable in the same sense, who can really help synthesize and flip that back into a language that can be used for alignment across the organization. And then who is that person on that team that kind of should be in charge of alignment? It's not that we all shouldn't be talking about it, right? But there's definitely like one or two people that always kind of float to the top of each team that really should be going to those level 10s or whatever you might have in your organization to keep spreading the word, bringing in stakeholders, really having the tough conversations around alignment, P&L distribution, things like that. You know, it's not this free-for-all team in business. It's still very much managed like business, but it's just managed differently at a different rate with a different collection of players than one might traditionally think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love, you know, now to take a question from the audience, because I think this takes it a little bit deeper and a little further in. And so the question is, so how do you avoid burnout when you're shifting a team from doing a job that they've done for years and can do without too much extra thought to having to be more on their toes to then always be testing? And it sounds like, you know, challenges could be that they're, you know, the business that's dealing with today's problems, so the urgent customer needs and short-term growth targets, yet the R side of R&D is to develop tomorrow's solutions. So how do you really drive alignment through this innovation process? Any tips you have to share there?
Yeah, can I just get right to the chase here? You manage and change their performance plan accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest, the fastest accelerator to burnout is when you're asking them to change what they do, how they do it, and support a different set of metrics or timelines without changing their performance management review metrics and cycle. Because they're still trying to operate to those milestones, whatever it is that gets them to a good bonus situation or they're still acting that way, even though their work is asking of them differently. So think about that emotional load they're carrying of being said, well, I really want to get to my bonus this year. I'm up for promotion. I've got to drive this way, but I'm being told to work this way. And that's just constant stress. I mean, to me, that's the quickest burnout, quickest way to burn out. And I've seen it time and time again. It makes me feel for these people that are put in these situations when performance management is not taken into account.
Right, and it's not aligned. Do you have anything you want to add to that, James?
Yeah, real briefly, I think that's absolutely right. Alignment of performance management and compensation, all that makes sense. And I think there's a little bit of a paradox there that the manager or the leader of that group, the owner of that product, needs to be aware of. You're talking about two almost contradictory cadences at the same time. You're saying in the day-to-day, speed up your thinking, speed up your output, speed up your experimentation, which is great. But the results of those things may actually be much longer in term. It might not be a quarterly impact. It might not be an annual impact. So this gets that essence of flexibility. Part of this is, back to the previous conversation, identifying and selecting people who are comfortable doing both of those things, because it's not everybody. Some people really, really want to be hands-on. I'm working in the known, I'm working in the knowable, and I'll execute extremely fast in that, but I need to know exactly where we're going with that. So I think that's part of it. The other piece is, I think sometimes leaders tend to assume, wow, I found a gem here. I found a rock star. This person has everything we need. And then they don't look for more help. They say, they got it. Let's keep running. And that person's sitting there like, where's my team? You go find your team. Well, you want me to find the team? You want me to lead the strategy? You want me to run the experiments? Can I get some help? And oftentimes, because again, you're looking for people who are achievement focused, they're motivated personally, they're usually inspired on a more emotional level to do this kind of work. They're also not the kind of people who are going to often say, I'm struggling, I'm drowning, I need help. And so the manager of that new product launch really has to have his finger or her finger on the pulse of that organization and say, hey guys, I can sense you're really, you're cooking with gas, you're cooking 6 burners, you might need some help. Let me get you some help. Or in some cases, let's take a quick break. You're going to be okay.
Yeah. And I just want to add one more thing. I loved how you said, Stacy, like a lot of times we get caught in this R cycle of the R&D when we're supposed to be solutions focused. Yeah. And this just ties into exactly what James said, like, where's my team? Like, be supporting that team. That also means you got to be shipping stuff, right? Yeah. And if you're shipping your testing strategy, if you said that you want to get through 4 prototype cycles, if you need to get your MVP or most lovable product or version 1, whatever it is you talk about, get it to the marketplace. Because I think that, on top of my performance management soapbox, shipping your work is incredibly rewarding. And you can say, look what I did. And even more importantly, look what we're learning and what we're going to do next. So it's almost like an injection of adrenaline over and over again. And I think a lot of companies, large and small, almost get stuck in either analysis paralysis, sorry to be cliche, or research cycles. We're like, well, we want to go back and just test that one piece, tiny piece of that feature. No. Is it good enough to ship and get out there? Can we ship an experience, even if it's a segment of the experience? Like, let's not worry about the font size of that particular button. Let's see if there's customers out there that want to engage with the product or whatever it might be. So my old boss at Capital One, he said, always be shipping. And it's so true. If you have teams that are working and you can ship and you can learn from it, then they're back on it with you and they're super excited to learn the next thing, right?
Exactly, right. And it's like I've heard, good is better than perfect, right?
Oh, right.
Get it out there, get some learning. So then I'd love to kind of take this opportunity to sort of look at some key takeaways in these areas, because we've talked about performance metrics. We've talked about getting the right folks who are an innovation mindset and can really work in this way. How do you, as far as takeaways, thinking about the audience and if they're either in the midst of looking for somebody to hire, shifting around in the organization a little bit and taking on some of these tips, what kind of tips would you give to really ensure that teams are fully empowered to learn constantly?
If you're a leader, I'm going back to the one piece you just said, and you're looking to hire people to serve these roles, you have to take a good look at yourself too and say, how much risk am I willing to take on? because I'm going to ask this team to take on a new risk, a new horizon, a new way of working, a limited budget. Like, right, innovation happens under constraints, big and small companies. It's the best thing you can do for innovation teams. But as that leader, if the leader is misaligned and they don't have a high tolerance for risk or the unknown, then we got to kind of like, I would hope said leader would be like, I'm actually not the right person to do this. Let me partner with somebody that can push me, and then we can kind of recruit this team together. So I'd actually want to like bubble my answer up to the very, the topmost person and say, are we right when we're starting, right? Because a lot of times that super senior level, they're all in, right? They get to go to all these highfalutin, like, personal training sessions. They think it's the best thing ever. Oh, but I have my massive middle to do with that. Make sure your massive middle is either self-identifying or they want the challenge. And they have the right mindset to then go out and build the right team too. Yeah, James, do you agree? Or
No, I do. I totally agree. And I think what we're both saying in terms of the major takeaway is at the end of the day, this process, this infrastructure still comes back to people. So it is absolutely about who do you select to lead it, to lead that new product launch, who do you select to work on that team. The other thing, to answer your question around how do I make sure the team's empowered to learn constantly is put some definition around what learning constantly is. Define that as behaviors, define that as things that people can be doing all the time. If you're in a old school company, you might have to celebrate that a little bit more often. You might have to celebrate the fact that people are doing things that are simply about learning, simply about generating ideas, because that is the lifeblood of innovation. And so if people aren't used to doing that, if they're used to everything being a once a week or once a month PowerPoint presentation, if they're used to everything being packaged before they can talk about it, you've got to reverse engineer what does it look like to have fluid, organic conversation around ideas all the time, where people are learning by experiments, small and large, all the time. And then what do those behaviors look like? And if we're not behaving that way today, how do we incent people, celebrate it, and reward it when they do?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
That's great. And this actually is a great segue into kind of our third bucket we really wanted to focus on today, really about company culture, right? So in thinking about this, I'm just reflecting back on another senior faculty said, like, culture eats process for lunch, right?
I love that.
So we're thinking,
so true.
Right? So we're thinking about culture and what is the culture? What are the systems and structures? And old traditional organizations have these very, and there's so much attachment to these cultures, right? It's ways how people are incentivized. It's how, what they're basically paid to do. What are the values behind them? And so, I'd love to kind of, talk a little bit more about company culture here. Like language, for example, that's a huge part of a traditional organization's culture, or really any culture. And we talked at the beginning of the conversation about the importance of having within your own innovation teams your own language. So, and that's also balancing the core and the new. So in looking at this, like, how can new innovation teams use language maybe as a tool to become adopted by the broader organization? And I know, James, you when we spoke earlier, you had a good example of this. I thought maybe now would be a great time to share that.
Sure. So I think specific to language, at the end of the day, people talk the way they talk inside of companies. They talk about strategy and innovation, new products, the way they do. And so, in a recent example I had, I was trying really, really hard to have a conversation with a client around a huge new initiative they were doing. It's definitely an innovation space. And this individual used a term that I'd never heard before. They used the term throttle forward and clutch back. And at first I was somewhat puzzled by this. I was like, what does that mean? But then I realized that's the language of that organization. That's the language of that culture. And rather than me listening to that and then presenting a whole other set of vocabulary, I could quickly realize that what he's talking about is when we need to speed up and slow down. And so how do I simply attach the recommendations, the solutions that we're coming up with? How do I embed them in that same language, that same vocabulary? Because again, sometimes we make these things really complicated. Let's forget we're all human beings. It's a lot easier to talk to each other when we're talking the same language. And so if I'm the one who wants to initiate that dialogue, it behooves me to understand how you'd like to speak. It behooves me to understand the language you're already using, rather than saying, let's talk about something new, and oh, by the way, introduce new language about it at the same time.
Yeah.
Amee, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I always like to remind people that nobody gets a diva pass. And nobody gets like the family lineage card. Like living here in the South, like most of the people I live around can trace back to, you know, I'm the fourth descendant of so-and-so and so-and-so. And it's like, I'm not. But it's more, I think so many times, and I think we saw this probably more like 8 to 10 years ago, these innovation teams were being created and they were just coddled and catered to and enough already, right? You're great because you developed a craft that we haven't seen yet, which is awesome. And we want to celebrate that. We all want to learn from it. But the people that built those big organizations, these organizations that are 20, 70, 100 years old, there is truth and science there too. And it's a mutual respect. And I always encourage more people to kind of have that lens when they're thinking about the culture from their team and the culture from the broader org or the language, and make it more of a fluid, organic exchange. Where yes, I need to kind of report on my stakeholder level at this way because they use this template and this is the way the executives are used to like learning things, and we can push that a little bit, but we don't need to like kind of totally recreate everything. At the same time, they need to be respectful and hopefully excited about working in sprints and how awesome dual track agile is for a lot of companies. Why certain things can be lean and cannot, right? And I think there just has to be this mutual respect. And I think if we go in there with a non-bulldozer mentality where we're inviting people in, and this goes to that collaboration piece, invite people in as much as possible. Like I remember like going to like analyst training stuff, so I understood how to speak their language better. Not sure about my proficiency yet even, but I at least made the effort to try and learn. At the same time, I would invite them into those early, you know, human-centered design research opportunities. So we got to see each other's world. So when we might have a little bit of friction in our language, we weren't too far off the mark. And then one person was always going to acquiesce to the other, but we learned how that went. But it's just like, it kind of just has to be like that no diva zone, like make it more organic and collaborative.
Make it approachable. You don't want your internal customers, if you will, to have to translate. We would say that's a bad idea if we were talking to an external customer, saying, hey, here's what we're doing. I'm going to make it really hard for you to follow me. So why would we do that inside the organization with our internal stakeholders and customers? The same rationale that drives us to clarity and simplicity with our customers and consumers should drive that same clarity and consistency with the rest of the organization.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I'm just curious, you know, to hear a little bit more about that, you know, in thinking about that, because it gets getting really tactical. And, you know, I can imagine in larger organizations, they have their language, a certain way of working, and then there's this team over here doing things in a new way. Like, do you have an example of integration? Like, how have you seen that be successful? And like, what type of steps can our audience take today to start thinking about kind of integrating language and how that might impact their culture?
Well, I got one real quick, and then I think Amy might have something to add to this. But, you know, in one situation, what I recall is we were often familiar with using something like a stage gate process. And it's less that there was a significant amount of outside integration as there was some of us who were maybe deeper practitioners in innovation, looking outside for learnings, looking outside for approaches and strategies and bringing those back into the organization. And what we did, probably somewhat unconsciously at the time, we weren't that intentional about this, is we did say to ourselves, okay, we're doing that, so we don't need to reinvent it or re-describe it. We're already doing that particular part of the process. We're already doing experiments, so let's not call that something new. Let's just call that, you know, stage one like it is today. But where there were things that were new, that were different, that we weren't doing, we at that point had such an established working team that we were able to sort of bring in best practices and tips from the outside in a pretty structured way. It was during a Friday meeting. It wasn't heavy. And we were able to say, hey, we should try doing this as part of our process. And in that particular culture, process mattered a lot. So if you wanted to get something new, tried, practiced, etc., you had to approach it from the lens of process. What is this going to do to the process we already have? Is this solving a process gap that we have? Or is this going to add more process? And the one thing that was probably most useful is, in most cases at least, we had a deal that if you were adding something to the process, you need to look, at least ask the question, is there something else that can come off or come away, so that we're not just adding more process to the system. And that's where a lot of our language comes from. It comes from the things we're doing as part of the process.
Yeah, yeah. And I have two complementary points of view on this. First of all, for those like everyday executioners, like we've all been, you're doing something new, and you might be using a different language on your day-to-day or within your development team or your design team or whatever that is. But don't be afraid to ask for help from a peer who's in a different job function, who can help you navigate more of legacy language. Because if that helps you in your stakeholder influence and communication, it's worth learning. And there are so many people that want to help because, one, they want to peek in the work that you're doing, but two, everybody likes sharing their own expertise. Like this is a truth no matter where I've been consulting to companies. Everybody is happy to share their expertise as long as like it's a win-win for an organization. And I don't want to say win-win for them because I don't think it requires a lot of ego there. And so to invite them in and say like, okay, I'm presenting to X, Y, and Z. This is what we're seeing here from our test and learn strategy or whatever that might be. But where's my quant piece? How do I bring that in? You know, I'm talking as a tried and true product person right now. And when you partner with a peer on that and you kind of create that holistic lens in a language that at least is good enough for everybody to start asking questions for, your influence aptitude skyrockets, which is exactly what you're after at the end of the day. And then I want to take that to the executive level where I was lucky enough to be in an organization where the executives started managing their work weeks in agile sprint models. Because everybody thought that agile sprint models were just for development teams. And they're like, no, we can manage this, and like truly understanding what our velocity was and how many tasks truly we can and can't get done in a week. And that was eye-opening because when you see like senior vice presidents struggle with agile, like on work that developers probably think is paper pushing work or something, it is enlightening because then we're kind of like all in it together. And that is that's equalizing a lot of struggle, and it's bringing everybody like to the same understanding, a shared understanding of just like, wow, it really is important to kind of like stay on task during a sprint because as a developer, I've agreed to this many points on my velocity. I have to get this done. If not, it's, I back up everything else. Whereas an executive that might be in charge of strategy, they might not see the day-to-day fallout of them not meeting their own deliverables because it all trickles downhill. And that was an amazing transformation of like a year and a half at this particular organization. I was so thankful to see it coming from the top down, the bottom up, and the massive middle, just kind of churning through it as we went. Like it was really incredible.
Yeah, and it really sounds like too, what I'm hearing is you took a test and learn approach to this, right?
Yes.
So you're actually applying lean startup to the culture or changing this vernacular. So that's what kind of tying it back to this thread throughout this entire conversation is it really is the mindset and then the behaviors around it. So really looking at, and it's been an inspiring conversation for me to really understand no matter which aspect, you can still apply the test and learn approach to even bringing in lean startup into your organization. And by having that mindset and proliferating that with more and more people, communication, self-awareness, communication, these are all best practices in order to really operate with this new way of working.
Right. And nothing we've talked about is hard. It's more about like being mindful of it.
Yeah.
And making it muscle memory, taking the cerebral time to make it muscle memory for you, your teams, and whichever way you're going in the organization.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, listen, we just have about a minute left, and I just want to give you guys a chance. James, is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I just think that the main point I would make is at the enterprise level, as I've said a couple times, I think a lot of it is about the people because you have so much existing culture, practice, systems in place. So getting people on board as they make that transition, to me, has been the most important piece, and when we've been successful, the key ingredient there.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you both. This has been great. And we've wrapped up the end of our time here. So I'm handing it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. That wraps up our show. We'll be having another Lean Enterprise webcast with Eric Rees this Wednesday, October 11th. You can register for that at leanstartup.co. And another reminder that Lean Startup Week 2017 is less than 3 weeks away. If you're planning on joining us in San Francisco, grab your pass before October 15th to save with our fall sale. You can visit our website for more information. Thanks again, everybody, and you guys have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.